Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Create and Consume, a podcast about what we make, watch, and buy in the era of digital content. I'm your host, Austen Tosone. It's almost time, once again, for New York Fashion Week. Yes, it's the time when the hotel prices soar, when the Ubers surge, and traffic below 14th Street is pretty much a nightmare. I'll share a bit of the history of Fashion Week in today's episode, how I think the event has changed over the years, and also my best tips and best practices for how to get invited and actually attend New York Fashion Week if you're an influencer or content creator, or if you are just interested in the whole behind the scenes of how the heck this whole Fashion Week thing even works anyway. Before we get into the main topic of today's episode, as always, let's do a little create and consume. If you're a newer podcast listener, this segment reflects the title of the podcast where I share what I have been creating and consuming for the past week. And I also want to hear from you. So come say hi over on Instagram, leave a comment down below if you're watching on YouTube, and be sure to reach out and let me know what you are creating and consuming as well. As far as what I have been creating this week, I actually just launched a brand new digital product on my Etsy shop. So if you don't know, I have an Etsy shop called The Bold Bride, which is pretty separate from the rest of my digital presence online, I would say. And I was inspired to create this Etsy shop after making a bunch of wedding planning templates and Canva PDF documents for my own wedding back in 2023. And I thought, this could really be useful for other brides who are planning weddings in the future. And that's why I decided to set up an Etsy shop. So I launched the shop with 2 products last year, but I just added my third product to my product suite on the website, and that is my bachelorette weekend itinerary. So this is an editable Canva PDF. You basically purchase the product and you get a digital download link to access this file as a Canva template. And from there, it's pretty much plug and play. I made one of these for my own bachelorette weekend, which was really helpful to share information about each of my bridesmaids because not everyone knew each other. Some of them had only heard of each other before, so some of them were meeting for the first time because I had friends from all different walks of life join me on my wedding day. It also had all of the details of where we were staying, how the hotel rooms were being divvied up, what time we could check in and check out, and a full schedule of events for the weekend. I think this is really helpful because bachelor and bachelorette trips, I think, can get really chaotic and overwhelming sometimes. So this was incredibly helpful for all of us to stay on the same page, manage expectations, and just generally know the run of show for the weekend so that no one was late to anything where we all needed to be together or stuff like that. So this has been really helpful for me personally, and I'm so excited that it is now finally available as a product. My Etsy shop is The Bold Bride once again, and I will leave a link down below to my new template so you can check it out. And it comes in 4 different colorways/styles. I was trying to appeal to a bunch of different options. So one of them is basically black and white, one of them is red and pink, one of them is pink and orange, and one of them is blue and white. That is available now. And it was one of those things this past week where it had been on my to-do list and I thought it might take me more time, but for some reason, once I get in the rhythm of creating a digital product like that, I just get fully sucked in and I'm ready to tackle the whole project right then and there. And to start off the new year on a strong note like that makes me really happy. As far as what I am consuming this week, Traitors Season 3 is out now. I knew this was going to be the best way to start my January by watching Traitors. At the time I'm recording this right now, I have seen the first 3 episodes. I loved the cliffhanger that we were left on. And if you're not familiar, Traitors is a reality show that brings together reality stars from all different genres, all different networks of shows, from things like The Challenge and Survivor to Bachelorette, to Housewives, to all of these different shows. And it is so fun to see all of these people together in one room. And the game of Traitors is essentially a kind of murder mystery dinner party-esque type game where there are a couple of traitors who are identified when they are blindfolded right at the start, who are able to, choose someone to eliminate the next day. And they continue to do that until they get to the end. And the rest of the group that are known as the faithful have to figure out who the traitors are and get them out because if the game ends with any traders still standing, then they win all of the prize money that has been collected throughout the season. It is a really, really fun show. If you're in need of some levity, I think this is a great one to add to your queue, and I'm currently streaming it on Peacock. With that being said, let's get into the topic of today's episode, which is New York Fashion Week. And New York Fashion Week has been around for almost 100 years now. We're actually getting closer to that 100-year mark. It first began in the 1940s, and it was initially called Press Week. And the reason for the event was initially a way to promote American clothing and manufacturing. A large majority of clothing used to be handmade and produced in the garment district right in New York City. I actually was able to intern for a fashion designer in the garment district back in, what year would that have been? Probably 2013, and it was a totally eye-opening experience. Fashion Week has evolved a lot, and now there are tons of different types of fashion weeks over the years. There are also men's fashion weeks and bridal fashion weeks, but typically, when you hear people talk about Fashion Week, they are usually referring to shows that occur in 4 major cities, which are New York, Paris, London, and Milan. And these are the women's ready-to-wear shows. So it's not really couture or high fashion. It's not necessarily swim and resort and stuff like that. It's really women's ready to wear. These shows take place twice a year, once in February and once in September, usually between like the 6th and the 12th, if I had to put a general timestamp on the whole thing, but the dates do vary depending on the year, depending on how the dates fall, and so on. When we look at the more modern history of Fashion Week in the early aughts and the early 2010s, Fashion Week was primarily attended by 2 main groups of people. One was buyers for retail stores, so think Macy, Nordstrom, Lord & Taylor, all of those department stores that would send buyers to these shows to preview the next season's clothing and pick out what they thought would sell well to actually put in their stores. And the second group that was often invited were the fashion editors, who would preview the collections to think about what they wanted to include in later issues of the magazines. And it's an interesting schedule that we kind of function on when you think about Fashion Week from that standpoint, because when we're talking about February Fashion Week, which is just a few weeks away at the time I'm recording this episode, what I'm actually going to be seeing in February at Fashion Week will be the fall winter collections for 2025. And then September Fashion Week will be the spring summer collections for 2026. So usually you're a season ahead, and traditionally when you think about buyers needing time to place orders, designers fill those orders, actually get them to the store, get them merchandised, and get them all set up. The same way fashion print magazines used to need that kind of crucial couple of months of lead time to plan out their stories, photograph things, get everything edited and approved, and then shipped off to the printer. That is kind of where that schedule stack came from. Some designers more recently have experimented with more see now, buy now models, where you can see clothing on a runway show and then shop it either right then and there, or a few days after, or a few weeks after. But in general, when we look at Fashion Week as a whole, you can expect that kind of staggering of the schedules and the collections. Now, bloggers and influencers did start to permeate Fashion Week. Depends on when you really want to put a pinpoint on it, but for me, the big turning point was in 2009, because there was an article published in the New York Times, and I will never forget, the headline was "Bloggers Crash Fashion's Front Row." And then the photos in the article, you could see people like Brian Boy and Tavi Jevonson sitting front row with renowned Vogue editors like Anna Wintour. And for context, by the way, since I used to be a magazine editor, and also since my mom was a magazine editor, I can tell you from firsthand experience that the hierarchy on the masthead of a magazine is something that used to be extremely sacred and taken very seriously. So the thought that someone who hadn't really, quote unquote, worked their way up in the ranks, that it wasn't this traditional system of how you got in and got invited to shows, was sitting next to someone who was so seasoned and so esteemed, really caused a bit of a shakeup, as you might be able to imagine. And I think this is very relatable to when you think about content creation today. I have talked a lot about the general frustration or the feeling of seeing creators who came up on TikTok blowing me away numbers wise, even though I had been putting in the time and hours as a content creator years before. And at the end of the day, I do think democratization of our industry, both of the content creation industry and also of the publishing industry, has ultimately been a good thing. But yeah, you can see how some of these editors might be a little bit like, what are they doing here? And, Fashion Week has changed a lot over the last few years. I think, especially now post pandemic and looking ahead to what role does Fashion Week really play for how we consume fashion, how we see new trends, how we digest street style, even in the future? I don't totally know the answer to that. I did do a blog post a few years ago called What is the Future of Fashion Week that I will link in the show notes if you're interested in reading. I feel like a good amount of my thoughts were kind of summarized in that story. But I do think the role of Fashion Week has evolved, and now it serves a little bit less of a practical purpose, as in before people, kind of needed to go for their jobs, to now seeing it as almost a pop culture movement or a moment on social media where it's not just that people have to go for their jobs, but so many people want to go. And I think there's a little bit more of that added element of frivolity when something is not as essential as it once was. Now it's kind of just something that people see as fun and see as a cool opportunity and a way to add some credibility to their resume or to give them something interesting to share on Instagram. All of that being said, at the end of the day, I do still love Fashion Week because I love being able to see the clothes in person first and foremost. That is the reason this whole event started in the first place, and that is still the number one reason why I like it and think it's worthwhile and make an effort to attend as much as I can. And also, it's a wonderful networking opportunity and time to catch up with people in the industry who maybe you wouldn't think to schedule a one-on-one lunch date with, or who maybe you've been meaning to schedule a one-on-one lunch date with, and everyone's just been so darn busy. It's a great way to just rub shoulders with incredible influencers, content creators, bloggers, editors, journalists, freelance writers, photographers. The list goes on and on and on of who is in a room with you. And I think there is something incredibly valuable about that. I personally feel like the last few years I've taken a bit of a backseat with Fashion Week, but I really would love to use this February Fashion Week as kind of a testing ground again for me to get back in front of PR people, for me to pitch myself again, and for me to share more fashion focused content. And then hopefully by September, I can kind of have a more robust schedule for Fashion Week. I can take time to vlog Fashion Week, to take people behind the scenes, and to kind of put myself back in the industry that I didn't necessarily mean to leave. It's just in the last few years after 2020 and after going through some changes in my business, like when I was launching my digital course, that was taking up a bulk of work for me in January and February. So that left little time to pitch and attend New York Fashion Week. And also, there were just some years where brands weren't showing, or they were showing in a very limited capacity. And suddenly the number of people who they could invite in was really minimal. So now that I feel like the dust has settled and I have a clearer head on my shoulders of what I want my life to look like as a content creator and what type of content I want to create and share with people, I feel a lot more confident knowing how I want to approach things in 2025. With all of that being said, I do want to get into some of the behind the scenes, including how to plan for Fashion Week, tips for getting invited to shows, what to do at an actual show or presentation that you do get invited to, and just have a little insider insight to what all of these events are like. Because I think at this point, I have now attended either 10 or 11 seasons of New York Fashion Week. And I want to first start out when we're talking about planning for Fashion Week with the fact that I am based in the New York City area. That is why I have attended so many seasons of Fashion Week, because I am literally just a train or subway ride away from 99% of the shows. And by the way, all of the tips and advice that I'm going to be referencing today are for New York Fashion Week. I have not yet attended any of the international fashion weeks, but I would absolutely love to one day. I have a lot of creator friends who are based all across the United States. I have creator friends in Chicago, Los Angeles, Seattle. And when I think about the expense and the cost that it takes to actually attend New York Fashion Week. I give anyone who is coming into Fashion Week from out of town credit because it is not cheap to visit New York, and it especially is not cheap during a time like New York Fashion Week, because that is when a lot of the downtown hotels start to book up. That is when Ubers will be surging, and it'll make getting around kind of tricky to do. So even though it can be expensive, it obviously is possible. And I just wanted to share a few things to keep in mind. The first is that it will usually, like 90% of the time, I would say, be cheaper to come to New York in February than September, because in September, not only are you kind of competing with other people for hotel rooms and things like that who are attending Fashion Week, but it's also one of the most beautiful times of year in New York City, and you're going to be competing just with all of the other tourists and people who want to come visit the city during that time. February is a lot less appealing for obvious reasons. It can be chilly, it can be snowy, it can be generally just a bit of a rougher time in New York, but it usually, more often than not, is quieter. And even people who are local might not go as much as they would prefer to in September when it's nicer out. So if you're listening to this episode in the future and you were thinking about going for September Fashion Week, it's just something to keep in mind. It doesn't mean you should feel discouraged or not go. It just might be a bit more competitive all around. I think that it's really helpful to set a budget for yourself and think about all of the things that you really want to get out of the trip, all of the things you anticipate doing, and also ask yourself, if you end up doing only one or two of those things, or even if you end up doing none of them, is it going to be worth it for you to come here and be in the city during that time? There are also lots of creators who choose to sit out Fashion Week entirely, who will maybe book a week in the city in June, call it, more so when Fashion Week isn't in the picture, and will come in and set up a bunch of coffee dates with fellow content creators, or ask to visit a brand's office or get lunch with a brand rep. And you could even hire a photographer to shoot some street style for you. That all might still be really valuable for you, and it might be a less chaotic and better way to spend a week in the city, especially when you look at the finances of everything, than if you do try to come during Fashion Week. It's a lot harder to get people one-on-one during Fashion Week, just because there's a lot going on and people are kind of bouncing around from place to place. Also, if there is a friend, a fellow content creator that you think would be a good companion for you to travel with, one of my favorite things during New York Fashion Week is when friends kind of travel together in groups. I know there are certain creators who come in from out of town with their friends, and I always look forward to following along the different POVs from creator to creator. And if you're willing to share hotel rooms or split Uber costs, obviously that can help lower the price of what you're paying to be in New York during such a busy time. Another thing to consider when planning for New York Fashion Week is obviously what you're going to wear, but I want to encourage you to remember that you do not need to buy an entirely new wardrobe for New York Fashion Week. There are so many ways to have fun with how you dress during New York Fashion Week that don't involve spending thousands of dollars on new clothes. One great option is to rent clothes. I actually have already ordered my Nuuly for the month with some items that I'm planning to wear during February Fashion Week. And if you have never tried Nuuly before and want a discount, I will leave a link for that down in the show notes as well. And in addition to Nuuly, there's also Fashion Pass and Rent the Runway and some other great places. If you're in New York City, you can also go to the Pickle store. I haven't personally tried Pickle yet, but I've heard really good things about it. And this way, you're able to rent clothing for a fraction of the price that you don't necessarily have to keep or hold on to, especially because Fashion Week is a time to experiment with how you dress, maybe catch the attention of a street style photographer, which I'll talk about a little later. Not to mention, some brands might also offer to dress you. You can also pitch some showrooms and see if you can borrow pieces to wear for New York Fashion Week. This is something I used to get offered a lot as an editor, and I haven't quite gotten up the confidence, I guess, to pitch on my own at this point, just because I'm able to kind of fill in the gaps between renting and also just what I have in my own wardrobe for the most part. However, there's nothing stopping you from doing this. You can look up New York City showrooms, see what the press contacts are, and ask if you are able to borrow some pieces during New York Fashion Week. And if the brand is willing to work with you and willing to do that, then that's one less thing you have to buy or pack also if you're coming in from out of town. I would also suggest suggest looking at the official Fashion Week calendar. Actually, as I'm recording this episode, I know the CFDA has put out their calendar for February. So I will link that in the show notes if you'd like to see what is happening in this upcoming season. But I would use this as a way to identify what your priorities are. If all of the designers that you're most interested in are just showing on 2 days, you could just come to New York for those 2 days. You don't have to stay the whole week just out of obligation. And you might still find other ways to fill your schedule when you're not attending shows that can make coming here for Fashion Week feel like a complete and fun experience. And that's one important thing I think to mention, is that you do really need to kind of take initiative to like build your own schedule and fill in the blanks. If it were me coming in from out of town and say I only had one show on one of the main days that I wanted to be in New York, and I was like, well, shoot, like I only have one Fashion Week show. What else am I supposed to do all day while I'm there? Some ideas are you could reach out to a street style photographer and book a shoot with them to shoot some additional looks and outfits that maybe you didn't actually get to wear to shows, but hey, you're there, you're in New York. I'm sure you can use the photos for something at a later date. I mean, if it were me, I would also maybe say, oh, I really haven't been to the Glossier store in Soho. Like, I'm gonna go in there in between Fashion Week things, and you could bring people along for that. And you can also think outside of the box when it comes to brand meetings. Of course, the fashion and beauty brands are going to have a busy couple of days, but are there any lifestyle brands, wellness brands, health brands, home brands that you could meet with during your time in the city? Thinking about it in that way will help you plan a schedule that makes sense for you, so you don't feel like you need to stay for a ton of extra days, and you can hit what your most important activities are right from the jump. Also, if you are an influencer or content creator, you'll know that sometimes brands offer transportation to and from events. They might send an Uber code, or they might give you some kind of voucher or something like that. I would say 99% of the time that does not happen during New York Fashion Week, so leave room in your budgeting to either account for Ubers, which I would really honestly avoid at all costs. They just get so expensive. Not to mention traffic downtown gets really bad during New York Fashion Week, and more often than not, it makes people late to things. I would strongly suggest packing comfortable shoes and planning to take the subway or the buses whenever you possibly can. It is the fastest and easiest way to get around, and I have lived in New York for 8 years and in Hoboken for 3 years. I'm in the city at least once a week, even living here, and I take the subway all the time. I've definitely seen a few weird things here and there, but in general, I have been very lucky to have always felt safe taking the subway. So my personal subway rules are just one, be aware of your surroundings at all times. Be smart. Don't have music up so loud in your AirPods that you can't hear what's going on around you. And try as much as you can to take the subway in well-populated areas and avoid late nights and very early mornings. Let's move on and talk about how to get invited to New York Fashion Week. And I have attended as an editor, as a freelance writer, and as a content creator before. And I feel like the rules of the game are pretty much the same across the board. There are definitely things that make it easier to secure invitations. For example, being an editor attached to a certain publication is something that's usually appealing to brands, or being a content creator with a certain number of followers or a certain audience affinity for fashion can help as well. However, I have also attended as a micro influencer, and I have been shoulder to shoulder with people who are editors at big name publications and who have way more followers than me. So it's totally possible to attend Fashion Week even as a small influencer. The number one best thing you can do for Fashion Week invitations is something that requires a bit more effort than just a one-off pitch twice a year, and that is to form relationships with PR agencies in New York or who represent brands in New York, and show year-round interest in their events and clients. For me, maybe one PR agency in the city represents a brand that I really love that shows at New York Fashion Week, but they also represent two smaller brands that they usually invite me to events or to come in and check out a new store or to sample a new product. And even though my inbox can get a little crowded from time to time, I always try to make an effort to show interest in everything that brand does, not just the one client that I'm interested in attending a show for during Fashion Week. I also try to check in when there's not a lot going on to ask if there's anyone who they represent who I could use for expert quotes for a story I'm writing for my blog, or even for one of the outlets that I freelance for from time to time. Showing year-round general interest in their clients, being responsive even if you can't attend events or something isn't a fit right now, will go a long way in relationship building with people who work at PR agencies. And more often than not, if you're a smaller creator and you're not getting flooded with invitations from certain designers or PR agencies, you're going to need to pitch yourself. You're going to need to put yourself out there and ask for an invitation to the show. It seems almost rude or counterintuitive to ask for an invitation, but it's not if you do it the right way. And the most important thing you should keep in mind when pitching a brand to attend a Fashion Week show is ask not what the brand can do for you, but what you can do for the brand. And that honestly is like 98% of it, because there are so many content creators and influencers who I know, because I follow PR reps on Instagram, who specifically complain about this and who sometimes will even post emails. They'll black out the email address and the names and stuff, but sometimes they'll share the emails that they get sent, and my mind is always blown when I see stuff like this. Creators who do this are giving other creators a bad rap, and I almost never say that or try to shade other creators. If you know me, you know that's not my style. However, some people do not have their heads screwed on properly. If you are in any way demanding to be invited to a show, if you have followed up 82 times and will not leave the person alone, if you choose to publicly share a PR rep's email address on something like Twitter or Threads or LinkedIn or whatever, so many of those things will immediately get you blacklisted from events. When I pitch a brand for New York Fashion Week, I tell them about my audience and how they love fashion. I show examples of previous Fashion Week coverage. I tell them where I plan to create and share content from Fashion Week, and I tell them how many followers I have on all of those various platforms. All of that is showing I have an opportunity to get their client exposure in front of a relevant audience, and that's, like I said, 99% of what they care about. Keep the emails really short and sweet. Follow up once or maybe twice if you really want to go to the show, but if you don't hear back after that, just move on to the next one. When it comes to finding contacts to pitch for New York Fashion Week, first and foremost, go to the brand's website. A huge majority of them at the bottom or on their press page will have a press-specific email for the brand, which might either be press@brandname.com or brandname@agencywebsite.com. Some brands will also throw creators a bone and list a specific email address just for New York Fashion Week invites, and that is always really helpful because that means it is headed to a much less cluttered inbox. And I like to keep track of this all just in a Google sheet, by the way. I put the name of the designer in one column, the email for the PR rep in another, the date of the show, the time of the show, whether or not I've sent the pitch email, whether or not I have followed up, and what my RSVP is for the show. Also, pitching directly is the best way to get invitations for New York Fashion Week shows. However, I will say if you are not seeing much success from pitches, keep an eye on Threads and also on the Instagram stories of creators that you follow. I personally have sent people in the past in my place. I've maybe gone on and said, hey guys, I have a show at 6 p.m. today that I can no longer attend. If someone would like to attend on my behalf, please message me with more info. And I usually will just ask that creator to send me a couple of photos and videos. I will send them the QR code or whatever they need to get into the show. And that way someone still gets to go and they can do the networking and everything on my behalf. But then I also am still able to share the content and support the brand like I was initially planning on doing. Now, on your way to a show, there is a chance that you may be photographed by a street style photographer. And I just wanted to share a few tips that I have learned and seen from over the years that can help you get photographed by street style photographers. Why do you want to do this? You could end up on their Instagram feeds. I love following street style photographers and seeing what people are wearing. Or that photographer could be there on behalf of a publication. So you could see yourself in a street style roundup in a publication like Refinery 29 or Cosmopolitan or even Vogue. Who knows? One big tip is to follow street style photographers ahead of time and engage with them so they get familiar with your name and your handle. So if they're out shooting one day and they recognize you, they could say, "Oh, I feel like I know that person. I think they follow me." And there's a higher chance that they will tag you and be able to properly identify you in any street style roundups, which is also a big help if you are trying to Google your name versus if you are just trying to cull through an 80 slideshow on a brand's website. And obviously on Instagram, if that photographer chooses to tag you, you'll get notified. You can also research current trends and incorporate that into your outfit planning. If there's a trend that you don't totally love or that you feel like you would just be leaning into for purposes of getting photographed, maybe consider skipping it. But one thing that street style photographers who are sent on behalf of publications are typically told to look for are for certain trending items. Let's just say that one fashion editor has said that leather trench coats are trending, and they instruct a street style photographer to say, "Hey, we did an article a few months ago about how leather trench coats are trending. See if you can photograph as many of those as possible, and we can link back to that other story we did." I'm just giving an example. Those are things that an in the know fashion influencer and content creator should hopefully be aware of. And so that might be something to think about and incorporate as you are getting dressed for that season's fashion week. Also, don't look too eager. And this is something I struggle with because I always want to give people the best shot if possible and be accommodating. But unless you're someone who is very well known and recognizable and a bunch of photographers specifically ask you to pose and bring you over to a certain area where they can get a better shot of you, not in a crowd of a bunch of people, I personally find that looking uninterested is actually the better way to go, because if you're too eager and you're posing and no one wants to take your picture, it's very awkward. If you look like you are woman on a mission or a dude on a mission or whoever on a mission, and you are like even on your phone or looking down or looking behind you, I don't know, I think those candid shots are things that street style photographers really crave and look out for. So I think it's worth it to look a little disinterested. Also, know where to walk. Oftentimes, for a venue like Spring Studios, if you approach from either direction, there will usually be street style photographers at the venue. If it's a lesser known venue, maybe just think about where people might be getting the best shots. You can even look up the venue on Google Street View ahead of time. And maybe you'll see, oh, if there's a playground right next to this venue, but there is a cool plain wall on the left side of it, that is probably where people would rather stand than in front of a playground. I'm just making this up, but like that is a true thing that I have done before, and that has given me the heads up to walk from the right direction in terms of increasing my chances essentially to be photographed by a street style photographer. And this is another reason why I would also skip the Uber, because if you take an Uber exactly to the front of the venue and there's no line to get in, you have a very limited window of when you can be photographed. Versus if you take the subway and you still have to walk a block or two, you can even loop around to approach from the direction that you're anticipating photographers will be looking for people to come from. Obviously, I can't speak on behalf of every street style photographer because all of them may have different things that they're looking out for, different trends that they want to photograph. But when in doubt, if you do want to stand out, consider wearing something eye-catching, whether that's something colorful, a dramatic hat, sequins, sparkles, feathers, something that almost adds texture or interest to their photos and kind of makes it an easy snap for them in the moment. Even if later in editing they don't choose to move forward with the image, at least you can feel good about knowing that you were captured. That sounds so weird out of context. No one clip that and make it sound like I am pro kidnapping. I mean captured by street style photographers. And one surefire way to get photographed by a street style photographer is to schedule a shoot with them. And many street style photographers, I think, offer this option during Fashion Week. I have one specific person to recommend in this circumstance, which is my friend Karia, who I have now known and worked with for, I think, 5-ish years. And we initially met because she took a photo of me walking to a show during Fashion Week where, mind you, I was on the phone and looking disinterested, although it was a fake phone call for that specific purpose. She DM'd it to me on Instagram. I responded. She later moved from Seattle to New York City, and we have been friends, and I have hired her many times since to photograph my outfits. So for this fashion week, at the very least, I have rented clothes from Nuuly, and I've scheduled a shoot with Karia. So at the very least, I will get some new photos and get to be in and around the Soho area when shows are going on. And I will add a link to Karia's Instagram in the show notes. Let's talk about when you're actually at a show. Sometimes you will get a seat for a show, and sometimes you will have a standing room ticket. If it's a presentation and there's like a 2-hour window you can go to the presentation, there's so much more flexibility. You can essentially go at any time, stay for 5 minutes, stay for an hour, whatever. Runway shows are different. Now, if you get a ticket that says standing room, I would try to get there as early as possible so that you can be at the front of the standing section. Those will typically be the first people who, once all of the seats are filled and there's like 2 minutes until the show starts, they will then say to the standing crowd, okay, please fill in if you see a seat. We don't have time for people who are running late. And even if you do have a seat in like a second, third, or fourth row, keep in mind that if seats in front of you are not filled by the time the show starts, a PR person or someone working the show might signal you to move up. So just be ready and prepared, because obviously the closer you are to the front row, A, it's a status thing. It's cool to be in the front row, but B, also you will have a more clear path to capture content. Also, when you get there early, there is a chance to network and say hi to people. I have made friends who I still am connected with today just from saying hi to someone standing in line or getting the Instagram of the person who I was seated next to. You never know who could be seated next to you. So I think it's always worth it to just smile and say hi. And again, this is one of those times where when I look back on all of the people that I've met during Fashion Week who I'm still close with today, there are really more nice people in New York City than I think New York gets credit for, especially in the fashion community. I feel like a lot of the, going all the way back to what I was talking about earlier, the hierarchy of the mastheads with magazines, I feel like a lot of that energy has kind of dissolved as a result of, like I was saying earlier, the democratization of this industry of publishing and also of content creation. And in general, people are really nice. And if you do get someone who's rude, don't take it personally. That's clearly some kind of issue they're having. But I have always found overall positive experiences when I do say hi, especially to someone who is there and who's excited and who's just like soaking in the magic of Fashion Week, because that does still exist to me even all of these years later. And then once the show or the presentation starts, capture more than you think you need. You can always edit down later, but you can't bring all of the models back and say, wait, could you do that one more time? That's not how it works. You have one chance to capture content. So capture more than you think you need, but try to stay in the moment as much as you can too. And then some things I like to typically carry in my bag with me to a show are a backup phone charger, because if the phone dies, we're all screwed. My vlog camera, if I'm vlogging, obviously, and a small tripod, if possible. I don't recommend using a tripod during the actual shows, but if you want to capture a video of your outfit later, if you run into someone after the show, sometimes that can be handy to have with you. A phone light, again, wouldn't recommend during like a runway show. That could be disruptive and you could get in trouble, but just to have for capturing content before or after, or if you're going to a party or whatever. Obviously, whatever your lip product is, if you need to touch up, maybe a concealer if you need to touch up. And if possible, a small water bottle and a granola bar. You'd be surprised. Sometimes the hunger just strikes during Fashion Week and you're in a place where you kind of can't do anything about it. Having a granola bar is kind of clutch. And also, even if it's not that time of the month, throw a couple of tampons in your bag. You'd be surprised who you might be able to save in the bathroom at Spring Studios if you have a tampon with you. It's kind of like that scene from Sex and the City where that really rude hostess wouldn't let Carrie and who was she with? Maybe Samantha into the restaurant. And then when she was in the bathroom, she had a tampon when she needed one. And that's how they got into the restaurant. All I'm saying is you just never know. So bring one with you. And another thing that has become more popular during Fashion Week that is not just the shows are also events and parties. And events can be fun because Some brands will kind of just host their typical influencer events, but they'll do it during Fashion Week. So that's another great way to potentially get invited. Let brands know that you're in town, you'd love to meet up, or you're interested and available, whatever words you want to use. You could end up at a really cool event that wasn't initially on your radar or obviously wasn't on the Fashion Week calendar. Parties, I used to like really zone into the idea of going to a Fashion Week party, and I am so glad I got to go to at least one with Nylon. I didn't get to go to the second one because we were rudely laid off just a few days before that happened, and as a result, we were uninvited from the Fashion Week party. Again, so rude. Nylon, if you ever want to make that up to me, I'm available now. Yeah, they're all kind of similar. Once you've been to one, I feel like you can say you've been to one. Parties usually for me are really late and are not always worth going to. And if you do choose to go to a party, I would just recommend making an appearance. I would also really recommend avoiding drinking, honestly, almost at all during Fashion Week. Whenever I do drink during Fashion Week, it doesn't usually bode well for me because it's typically a pretty packed schedule and it's just not the time. Like, you can have a nice glass of wine when you're all done. This is just my personal opinion. Like, you do you. If you want to, go ahead. But I just find that it doesn't really lead to anything good, especially if it's like at 9 or 10 at night and then you have an early morning the next day. And what can I leave you with in terms of some other kind of final tips or general advice? I think I would say try not to compare yourself to others. I know classically this is always easier said than done, but really at the end of the day, you're there for you. You're there to get your specific experience and just be grateful to be there. I think that that is something that's really underrated is gratitude. Remember in the moment, like just say to yourself, I'm at New York Fashion Week. Like that's so fucking cool. Like it is exciting and it is a big deal even to be invited to one show or one presentation, even if you didn't get all of the invites that you wanted, even if the designer you were hoping would lend you clothes never responded to you. Like when you're there and you take a moment to take stock of that, it is a big accomplishment. And I think it's really cool. And on the subject of gratitude, send thank you notes to brands that invited you to shows. You'd be amazed how very few people do this. And I think it will not go unnoticed. And it'll take 2 seconds to do, especially if you only went to a handful of shows. And remember, keep those relationships building year round. It is really important to stay in the loop, stay up to date, and make a conscious effort to respond to emails of the PR firms that do represent the brands so that you have a chance of being invited next season. Also, I probably should have said this earlier, but if you need help writing pitch emails, my ebook, Write on Pitch, contains several examples of how you can pitch to brands. It contains tips for all kinds of ideas too. Like even if you want to pitch brand collaborations outside of New York Fashion Week, that's a great resource. So I will link it in the show notes. And I think that just about does it. So thank you guys so much for listening to this episode. Let me know if you have any questions that I didn't answer in this episode. And as a reminder, you can support Create and Consume for free by doing any of the following. You can leave Apple and Spotify ratings and reviews. You can like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell if you're watching this episode on YouTube. You can follow along at Create and Consume Pod on Instagram and TikTok. You can send this episode to a friend who might enjoy it. And as always, don't forget to check out createandconsumepodcast.com for episode recaps and more. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll talk to you soon.